Hello everyone, and welcome to the History of the Crusades. I picked this as the first series I'm going to do on this channel because the Crusades has always really interested me, and I think it's an ideal thing to do a series on. The Crusades is something that everyone generally knows a little bit about, but not the details. People know the kind of general gist, Crusaders, Saracens fighting over the Holy Land, Jerusalem changing hands back and forth, something, Kingdom of Heaven film, but not a lot of actual detail there. And so I want to go through the actual detail, and we can take a look at the weird, horrific, and sometimes just downright wacky history of the Crusades. And I thought a good place to start would be the First Crusade. And today we're just going to be looking on how the First Crusade got started, because it really wasn't that simple. Today we take it a bit for granted that holy war was just a thing in the Middle Ages, but at the time of the First Crusade it really wasn't. So we're going to be looking at the history to try and make sense of how a religion who includes a top 10 list of things you absolutely should never do, which includes kill people, somehow launched a massive invasion with the sole intent of killing a lot of people. So to understand the Crusades, we have to go right back and understand what Europe was really like in the 11th century. We get this idea of a medieval world as being, established kingdoms warring with one another, but really in the early 11th century, that wasn't the case. Europe was absolutely fragmented. There were a lot of local lords exercising power really over their immediate area. Really what we mean when we think about the nobility of the time really were just armed thugs with their band of trusted men who would later become knights, who would essentially extort the local peasantry in return for kind of keeping them safe / kind of fighting off other people who wanted to extort them. They did have kings at the time, but a lot of the cases kings were only really kings in name. A lot of the local lords would sort of pay theoretical homage to their king, but most of the time wanted the king dead. Good examples being the King of France couldn't really leave his immediate lands for fear of being killed by one of the local lords. And at the same time, there was a huge conflict between the church and the crown at the time over who was in charge. So to kind of understand where all of this is coming from, Europe as we kind of know it today was really evolving as a concept at the time. It was the Christian remains of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire broadly got broken into two different sections. In the West, you had these tiny little broken states, which I've been talking about up till now. In the East, you had the very large, but really quite weakened, Eastern Roman Empire. And take a bit of time here to talk about that Eastern Roman Empire because it gets a lot of names. The name you're probably the most familiar with is Byzantium. There's a name very often thrown around in modern academia, but it is worth just noting that Byzantium was not used at all at the time. Really, that came about after the sack of Constantinople coming after the Fourth Crusade, something we'll get into in a future episode. But basically, the word Byzantium and a lot of the language that's used around it really came by Catholic propagandists trying to excuse the fact that they burned down the largest city in Christian world. Now, to make things even more complicated, no one at the time could agree the name of what this area would be called. The people living there called themselves the Romans. They saw themselves as the genuine, direct descendants of the Roman Empire. They really effectively were. The Roman Empire never really fell. The Western Roman Empire fell, the East continued. But the Western Europeans really didn't like referring to them as Romans because Romans at the time had this big history of being this massive, important power. And not only that, but a large part of the West considered itself the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, which had nothing to do with the real Rome, just more complications at the time. So to kind of put down the Eastern Roman Empire, they just refer to them as the Greeks. So we've got these three names, can call them the Romans, can call them the Greeks, can call them Byzantines, just for the sake of simplicity and to keep up with a lot of more modern language. I'll just be calling them Byzantines throughout the series, but you just bear that all in mind. Now, I did leave the caveat there that Europe was the Christian remains of the Roman Empire, so what happened to the rest? Well, the Islamic conquest happened to the rest. The Prophet Muhammad died in 632, and following his death, the Islamic world kind of exploded across Africa. The Arab tribes that had adopted Islam followed through with the requirements of jihad, that is, a struggle, and waged war on all of their neighbours with the goal to make the entire world controlled by Islam. And they were massively successful at this. Very usefully for the timing, the two neighbours of the Arab tribes, Byzantium and Persia, these two massive superpowers, were absolutely exhausted after fighting each other for nearly 3 decades, ending in 628. And so this meant that as Muhammad died, as the Arab-led armies began to expand, they were expanding into much, much weakened neighbours who fell really quite rapidly. Between 635 and 641, Syria and Palestine were conquered. Notably, Caliph Umar entered Jerusalem in 638 without a fight. The conquest of the rest of Persia occurred by the end of 642. Egypt at the same time fell by 642. And then in the west, the Islamic conquest basically broke into two halves. One focused on the Byzantine Empire, getting all the way to Constantinople, which was besieged between 674 and 677. Now, Constantinople did hold out on the siege, it was not conquered, and this effectively stopped the Islamic conquest from getting into the Balkans. The Byzantine Empire at this point was saved, but it had notably lost naval supremacy, which it would never recover. The other kind of angle of attack was going through Africa, and by 698, all of Byzantine Africa had been conquered. In the 8th century, they began to push into Spain, which at the time was home to the Visigoths, one of the various nomadic tribes that had defeated the Western Roman Empire. And by 713, much of Visigothic Spain was under the control of the Islamic conquest. Now, that push in the far west got into France, only being defeated in 732 by the Franks at Poitiers. Now that ended the major expansion phase. The Islamic State then really began to fragment into a series of much smaller states. The Umayyads were based in Cordoba in modern-day Spain. The Fatimids led a Shiite minority in North Africa and Egypt, and the Abbasids were based in Baghdad. These various Islamic countries were no really more warlike than any other European neighbour. They would launch various raids into their neighbours, but that really wasn't any different from the rest of the Western world. There were some expansions, notably Sicily was conquered in 830, but there was nowhere near that same kind of massive push. It's also worth noting at this time that there was no mass conversion of the conquered people to Islam. Certainly people did convert, but it wasn't wholesale. And this is really because non-Muslims were tolerated as long as they were under Muslim rule or in the Dar al-Islam, and kind of helping those Islamic rulers from being tempted to forcibly convert their population. People of the book, that is, people of Jewish and Christian faith, were tolerated, but they did have to pay an extra tax. There was a financial benefit there to not convert the population. And yeah, Byzantium was forced back, but they did have a bit of a resurgence in the 900s. In 963 to 969, they captured Cyprus and Antioch. 974, parts of Iraq were conquered. And by 975, parts of Syria and Palestine were retaken. Not their original boundaries, but certainly pushed back and stabilised the Eastern Roman Empire. So you might then expect, well, that's the cause of the Crusades. This massive Islamic invasions made the West terribly afraid of their neighbours, and not really. After that invasion, as we said, there wasn't really much else. There were minor border conflicts, but again, that's no different from the rest of Europe. And really, the West didn't really see the Islamic neighbours as anything different from their neighbours in France, Italy, Germany, and various other states. So, where does it all begin? Well, it begins, weirdly enough, with the Peace and Truce of God movements. And this really came about through the church trying to rectify a really weird situation. That is, that, as we said, Bible pretty strongly says don't kill people. And yet the entire aristocracy was based around killing people. We said the lords, the nobility, were essentially just militarized thugs. They were people who could afford swords, who trained in the use of weapons and horses, and would just exercise their power over their neighbours. They maintained their power by killing their neighbours. And so we have this odd system where the, in theory, Christian world, which should have been pacifist, was very, very much dedicated to war. So to try and fix this, in the early 11th century, there were various Peace of God proclamations. These were various attempts to take oaths to protect non-military people, to at least make sure that the armed thugs were only killing armed thugs and not killing random peasants, and especially not killing the clergy and robbing churches. And this was done sort of sporadically in Aquitaine, Burgundy, Rhineland, didn't massively take hold. In the 1020s, there were a series of truces of God, which were periods where no violence whatsoever could occur. And this would be revived later in the 1080s, approaching the start of the Crusades. And this was certainly backed by church law, at least in some ways, notably in 1054 at the Council of Narbonne. It was declared that no Christian shall kill another Christian, for whoever kills a Christian undoubtedly sheds the blood of Christ. Again, not really worrying about the Ten Commandments there as much as a certain interpretation of the Bible. But all of this really didn't manage to stop the constant conflict in Europe. There were always fighting, always killing, and so one line of thought was maybe that massive killing can be redirected to a little bit more of a holy purpose. And this was backed again by the Bible. The Bible, being the Bible, is a very mixed topic. And notably, there are plenty of instances in the Bible where armed conflict is definitely supported. There are many wars throughout the Bible that have the direct backing of God. I'm not going to go into every single one here, but just for a couple of little highlights, Jeremiah 48:10 says, "Cursed is he who keeps back his sword from bloodshed." And Samuel 15:3, God ordered Samuel to annihilate the Amalekites and, quote, "men, women, infant, and suckling." So yeah, definitely some biblical backing there for the idea that war can be approved by God. And this started to get some more backing, notably from popes trying to excise their control. Really starting in about 1053, where Pope Leo IX offered German troops fighting under his personal command the remission of penance for fighting with him. It's kind of expanded. In 1060, Norman invaders of Muslim Italy were given the papal banner, that is, implicit papal blessing for their conquest. And again, here we're getting this kind of idea that violence could be acceptable if it was on some kind of outside enemy, trying to take all of these violent thugs and move them away from just robbing the church. And again in 1066, William of Normandy, aka William the Conqueror, was given a papal approval and a papal banner for his invasion of England. Now, this wasn't because Harold Hardrada was not Christian, but he was labelled an oathbreaker. He had promised the throne to William and had taken the throne himself. But these early attempts to kind of legitimize just wars were conflicted. Notably, despite the papal approval, in 1070, any who had killed or wounded others during William's invasion was given penance for their actions. This kind of nascent sense of just holy war was really increased in the 1070s during what's known as the investiture contest. Now, there's no way I can give the investiture contest the thorough explanation it deserves in this video or even in this series. Certainly will need a series of its own. But long story short, the investiture contest was a big throwdown between the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire as to which one of them was the boss of the other one. It's a great topic I'd like to get into in a future video. It involves lots of fun things like anti-popes, and the word anti-pope is one of my favourite words ever, so we will take a look at that at some point. For now, what we need to know is the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor were in conflict. And the Pope at the time was Gregory VII, and he really tried to use this as an opportunity to expand his own authority and further this idea of a just army fighting against the unjust world, notably trying to recruit knights into the Militia Sancti Petri, or the Militia of St. Peter, and he again offered all those who fought for his cause the absolution of sins. In 1074, he continued this, where he announced his intention to personally lead an army to assist Eastern Mediterranean Christians, essentially proposing the First Crusade. Although he would never follow through with this, it did kind of set the stage for his protege, Urban, who we'll come back to very shortly. Now, Gregory's announcement here during the investiture contest to lead an army to the east was partially due to the Battle of Manzikert, where the Byzantines had been handed a massive defeat, which would leave them weakened, and again we'll see them in that weakened state very shortly when Urban comes about. Now, Gregory VII loved this idea of granting absolution to various knights who were doing wars that he felt were just. Notably, he handed them to Count Roger and his knights during a campaign against Islamic-controlled Sicily. And again, in 1080, to those who were invading Byzantium to install what he felt was the rightful ruler. Again, wasn't the rightful ruler, don't really have time to get into that one today, but he was quite happy handing out this idea of remission of sins, remission of penance, if he felt the war was just. So Gregory did a lot with establishing this idea of a just war, but never followed through with an actual crusade to the east. That would be left to Pope Urban II. The event that kicked all of this off, in theory, was in March 1095. Ambassadors from the Byzantine Emperor, Alexis I, appealed to the Pope for aid. This is really because when Alexis seized power during a coup, he found the empire in a really bad state, with Constantinople being secured, but literally over the Sea of Marmara, within visual distance of the palace, were Islamic camps on what is now mainland Turkey. But this really wasn't anything new. Byzantine emperors had been appealing to the West for aid for centuries at this point, mostly getting piecemeal, small groups being handed to them. But here's where Pope Urban saw a chance to really strengthen papal control. And really that's what Urban was all about here. He wanted to set up the papacy as the true centre of the Western world. And a massive invasion of the East with a papally endorsed army of thousands certainly would give a lot of strength to that. On top of that, as we've seen, getting a lot of these armed men out of Europe and in the East would certainly help with stopping Christians killing Christians. And so Urban embarked on a massive tour of Provence in 1095. During this, he really crisscrossed the countryside, going to Languedoc, the Rhone Valley, Burgundy, Auvergne, Limousin, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Poitou, Bordeaux, Moussac, Toulouse, Carcassonne, Montpellier and Arles, really covering a lot of land, talking to a lot of local lords, and steadily laying the seeds of what would be the Crusades. And it's worth noting he didn't cover all of France. He did make a point of avoiding the lands directly controlled by the French king, who he would excommunicate at Clermont, and he also avoided the lands of William II of England and Robert of Normandy, William the Conqueror's two sons, who had been far too successful in their attempts to control the church. Now, all of this preaching really reached its head at the Council of Clermont. This was a cathedral in Auvergne where a massive gathering was called. 13 archbishops and 82 bishops, including bishops from the Anglo-Norman regions, from Artois in Austria, and from Italy, were all gathered here. And during this, he did preach the call to Jerusalem. However, that wasn't the only thing he called. This massive gathering was more about, once again, reinforcing papal authority and church discipline. And so more than 30 decrees were given out, including decrees on penance, church organisation, church discipline, simony, clerical marriage, lay investiture, and sanctuary, all looking at really reforming the church into a much more powerful, much more organised system with the Pope at its very head. But for our purposes, the call to Jerusalem is the most important one, is certainly the one that history certainly remembers the most out of this, although it is worth noting at the time that a lot of the contemporary histories completely overlook the call to Jerusalem, mostly focusing on all of these other groundbreaking shifts to the church. And as part of this, once again, the remission of sins was granted to anyone who took part in the call to reclaim Jerusalem for the Christians. And this granting of remission of sins, as seen by Gregory and Urban, really is quite a major step forward here. This is the Pope assuming direct authority to absolve sins, which beforehand had really been left up to God, and it now paved the way for war to be penitential. That is, going on one of these holy wars was something that you could do to account for previous misdeeds. Now, the Pope was aging at this time. His massive tour was putting enough strain on him as it was, and so in his place, Adhemar of Lipoi was appointed as the head of this army. It is also worth noting at this point that the word crusade was not used here at all. Urban called it a penitential holy war. Word crusade would come about later. Now, the actual council here was incredibly theatrical and absolutely staged, notably trying to get a lot of audience participation, which really wasn't part of the Catholic world up to then. Notably, the slogan Deus lo vult was established and would be shouted at intervals in order to help the congregation learn that they were supposed to be taking part. Deus lo vult meaning God wills it, and being kind of a slogan for the Crusades throughout history. Equally, converts were planted within the crowd to be the first to come forward and take part in another bit of theatrics known as taking the cross, where they would approach the Pope or papal delegates and they would get a wool or silk cross stitched onto their clothes. Now, this isn't the massive red cross you'd see by Templars in later centuries. This was large enough to be seen, but small enough to fit onto a shoulder. And again, this was completely unusual for Catholic ceremonies at the time, and so these converts were really there to demonstrate what the rest of the crowd should do. At Clermont, it was Adheimer, but throughout the rest of the preaching, you'd have other known converts who wanted to take part, who were placed in the crowd in order to volunteer themselves in the moment. Now, oaths were sworn when they took the cross in order to carry out this march on Jerusalem, but there was quite a bit of miscommunication here. Some saw themselves as pilgrims, and with them they took things like napkins and satchels and staffs, traditional implements of pilgrims. However, originally Urban hoped to keep the idea of pilgrimage and this crusading distinct. As we said, he called it a penitential holy war, not a pilgrimage. But really the two rapidly blended together, notably when local clergy were preaching after Clermont. They very rapidly blended the two together, mostly to make these weird ideas more understandable. As I said, the idea of going off and marching thousands of miles in order to fight people you've never seen before, all backed by the church, was quite odd, but people did understand the idea of pilgrimage, and so the idea of an armed pilgrimage was a lot easier to explain to most people. However, despite Urban's wishes, many who did take the cross really did just go on a pilgrimage. They had no martial skills whatsoever, no intent to take part in fighting. They thought they could just go along, absolve their sins, or were caught up in the moment. And Clermont was just the beginning. Urban did take a short while over the Advent period to attend local services, but then in March 1096 he really began to push the preaching, going to Tours and Martin-Moor, really planning his journey to arrive at local ceremonies where there were going to be large crowds, and coinciding his preaching with Lent and Advent, again periods where people were thinking about absolution of sins to get the best impact. And he had thoroughly planned this. He was planning the expedition to start on the 15th of August of 1096. And this date was not picked arbitrarily. It was the Feast of the Assumption, but it would give time for the local lords to raise armies and notably to take in harvests, so that their lands would be well supplied, as would their armies. We'll see some of that not working out quite so well next time, but the planning was in place. And this was massively successful. High proportion of the noble recruits came from areas that Urban himself visited or were immediately nearby, so people who would have seen Urban preach. And it worked. Within 12 months, maybe as many as 80,000 people had left their homes for the East. Now for the story of what happens next, we'll have to wait till next time, where we'll be taking a look at the first group to come together, which has been nicknamed the Peasants' Crusade. And so I hope you join me next time, where we will look at Peter the Hermit's armies and the absolute mess they got themselves into. Till then, I hope you found this interesting, useful, or informative, and I hope to see you in the next video. Till then, take care. Cheers.